On an April night in 2008, the calm waters of Clearwater, Florida, shimmered beneath the moon like glass. For the people who lived there, Honeymoon Island was a place of serenity, a retreat where waves whispered secrets to the shore. But that night, the ocean was not the only thing keeping secrets. Rachel Monroe, a 20-year-old marine biology student at the University of South Florida, finished her late shift at a roadside coffee shop. She was radiant, her smile the kind that lingered in the memory of customers long after they walked out the door. With her canvas bag slung across her shoulder, filled with books and seashells, she drove her silver sedan toward Honeymoon Island, her sanctuary, her place to dream of sea turtle conservation and the future she was determined to build. By morning, her seat in class was empty, her phone silent, her dorm untouched. Hours later, police found her car abandoned in the sandy parking lot. The keys were still in the ignition. On the passenger seat lay her canvas bag, neatly packed as if waiting for her return. Outside, the scene painted a darker picture. Footprints etched in chaotic patterns, a torn pair of jeans caked in mud, and a small bloodstain glistening under the flashlight beams. The trail ended where the tide lapped at the shore. Rachel Monroe had vanished. Imagine her parents standing there, staring at the car that still smelled faintly of sea salt, the hood cool, the silence deafening. Imagine the dread sweeping through Clearwater when they realized that the cheerful girl who poured their morning coffee was gone, and whoever was responsible might be among them. This is not just a disappearance. It's one of Florida's most haunting true crime cases, a story of obsession, betrayal, and justice delayed for 15 years. Stay with us. Hit subscribe and keep watching, because the truth hiding behind Honeymoon Island will leave you breathless. Rachel Monroe was more than just a name in a police report. Before her story became one of Florida's most chilling true crime cases, she was a daughter, a student, and a young woman whose presence lit up every space she entered. To understand the weight of her disappearance, you have to first understand the life she carried with her, and the dreams she never had the chance to fulfill. Rachel was born in 1988, the only child of Daniel and Linda Monroe. From the start, she was the kind of girl neighbors remembered. Curious, endlessly kind, and always outdoors. While other kids spent afternoons glued to television screens, Rachel combed the shorelines of Tampa Bay, collecting seashells and scribbling notes in a little leather-bound journal about what she found. She loved the ocean, not in a casual, postcard sense, but in the way some people love home. For her, the sea was not just scenery, it was her calling. Her parents often said she was born with salt water in her veins. By high school, her dream had crystallized. She wanted to study marine biology, focusing on sea turtle conservation. Those fragile creatures that fought against impossible odds to reach the ocean became her symbol of resilience. Rachel spoke about them with such passion that friends joked she'd rather marry a turtle than a man. Behind the laughter, though, there was admiration. Everyone who knew Rachel understood her devotion wasn't just a phase, it was her life's mission. At the University of South Florida, Rachel's professors quickly recognized her brilliance. She wasn't the top of the class simply because she studied hard. She had a way of asking questions others overlooked. Why did certain turtle hatchlings survive longer? What did changes in seagrass health mean for the broader ecosystem? She connected dots others didn't even see. More than once, faculty whispered that Rachel had the potential to become one of the leading marine scientists of her generation. But ambition never hardened her. Rachel was approachable, her energy contagious. She worked part-time at a small coffee shop in Clearwater, not just for money, but because she loved people. Customers adored her. She remembered names, favorite drinks, even little details about their families. She treated strangers like friends and friends like family. Her laugh, as many recalled later, was the kind that made you feel warmer just hearing it. April the 12th, 2008, began like any other day for Rachel. She woke early, attending her morning biology class, where she sat in her usual seat near the front. Her notebook brimmed with doodles of sea turtles alongside detailed notes. That afternoon, she stopped by her dorm, tidied her desk, and sent a quick email to her professor about an upcoming project. Then she headed to her shift at the coffee shop, wearing a light blue shirt and jeans. Her coworkers remembered her being in good spirits that night. She joked about exams, teased a regular customer about his endless refills, and spent her break sketching in her notebook. As the shift ended, Rachel slung her worn canvas bag over her shoulder. It was her signature accessory, the bag she used to carry textbooks, a few seashells, and sometimes snacks for long study sessions. That detail, seemingly small, would become haunting later. At closing time, Rachel waved goodbye to her coworkers, stepping into the humid Florida night. The salty breeze carried the faint sound of waves. She unlocked her silver sedan, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. To her, it was routine, the end of a long day. But for everyone who loved her, it was the last moment she was seen alive. Driving toward Honeymoon Island wasn't unusual for Rachel. Friends said she often went there when she needed to clear her mind. The beach was her private refuge, where she could sit for hours, listening to the surf, dreaming about the future she believed was within reach. It was a place of peace. And that night, April 12th, it was supposed to be nothing more than that, peaceful. But you can almost feel the chill now, can't you? That sense when someone familiar drives into the night, and you realize later that they were stepping into the pages of a nightmare. It's unsettling because it forces you to ask, how many of us have walked into the dark, trusting the world would be kind, only to discover the world can be cruel? By morning, when Rachel missed her biology class, friends first assumed she had overslept. But Rachel wasn't the kind of student who skipped without a word. She was punctual, reliable. When her phone went unanswered, worry began to spread. By noon, her roommate checked the dorm, her bed untouched, her belongings neatly in place. That's when unease hardened into fear. Her parents, Daniel and Linda, received the news with growing dread. They tried to reassure themselves. Maybe Rachel was with friends. Maybe she'd forgotten to call. But deep down, a current of fear pulled at them. That night, as the sun fell over Tampa Bay, Daniel picked up the phone and called the Clearwater Police Department. His voice shook as he said the words that no parent ever wants to say. "My daughter hasn't come home since last night. Please help us." Eights. That single call marked the start of a nightmare that would consume not just the Monroes, but an entire community. Officers immediately retraced her path, from the coffee shop to Honeymoon Island. Flashlights cut through the darkness of the beach parking lot, until suddenly they froze on a chilling sight. Rachel's silver sedan. The driver's door was slightly ajar. The keys were still in the ignition. On the passenger seat, her canvas bag lay untouched, holding nothing more than books and her notebook. There were no signs of a trip, no packed clothes. It was as if she'd stepped out for just a moment, only never to return. Then came the darker discoveries. The sand near the parking lot bore chaotic footprints, overlapping, frantic, as though a struggle had taken place. And there, half buried in mud, officers found a torn pair of jeans, a small stain of blood on the hem. This was no longer a story of a missing student. This was the beginning of a criminal investigation, one that would stretch on for years, tormenting Rachel's parents, dividing her community, and leaving Honeymoon Island forever haunted. And as the waves crashed indifferently in the background, the quiet coastal town of Clearwater changed forever. If you believe stories like Rachel's deserve to be remembered, comment 1 below. If you think we missed the mark, comment 0. Your voice matters, and it helps us continue shining a light on the darkest corners of true crime cases. The moment Rachel's silver sedan was found at Honeymoon Island, the story shifted from a missing person case to something far more sinister. That small, sandy parking lot, normally a quiet gateway to the beach, became the stage where fear would take root in Clearwater for years to come. Officers who first arrived described the scene as unnervingly still. The wind carried the scent of salt and seaweed, the waves lapping against the distant shore. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. Cars had been left overnight before, especially on weekends. But the details here told another story. Rachel's sedan wasn't parked neatly between the lines. It sat off to the side, angled awkwardly, as though stopped in haste. The driver's door was left slightly ajar, and the keys dangled in the ignition as if waiting for their owner to return. Inside the car, the familiar canvas bag rested on the passenger seat. Its contents, books, a notebook, a pen, painted a picture of routine. It looked like she had simply set it down, planning to return within minutes. But outside, the ground spoke louder than any personal item. Flashlights revealed overlapping footprints pressed deep into the sand, chaotic in pattern, like two people had struggled, twisting, pulling, resisting. The prints trailed in multiple directions before vanishing near the line where the tide swept the shore. Investigators crouched close, noting drag marks faintly visible between the shoe impressions, as if someone had been pulled against their will. The air grew heavier as one officer bent down to pick up something half buried near the shrubs. It was a torn piece of denim, the leg of a pair of jeans. The fabric was damp, clotted with mud, and on the hem, a faint but unmistakable stain of dried blood. Under the stark glare of the flashlight, the discovery turned the air electric with dread. At that moment, every officer on the scene knew. This was no ordinary disappearance. This was evidence of violence. In a news spread quickly. Before dawn, word had reached the Monroe family. Daniel and Linda rushed to Honeymoon Island, their hearts pounding with a hope they already feared was slipping away. When Linda saw her daughter's car, she collapsed against the hood, her trembling hands running across the cold metal as if trying to summon Rachel back. Daniel, usually composed, stood frozen, staring at the drag marks in the sand. His eyes were hollow, his lips moving silently as though bargaining with the universe. Not my daughter. Please, not her. The scene became surreal as yellow police tape went up. Patrol cars lined the lot, their red and blue lights flashing across palm fronds swaying in the wind. The sound of waves, once calming, now seemed cruelly indifferent. For the Monroes, it was unbearable to be so close to the place where Rachel had last been, and yet powerless to cross the line drawn in tape. The discovery shook Clearwater to its core. By morning, whispers raced through town. At the university, Rachel's classmates were in disbelief. Just yesterday, she'd been laughing in the coffee shop. Now, her car was evidence in a potential crime scene. Some students cried openly in hallways. Others huddled into tense silence. Professors tried to carry on with classes, but the absence of Rachel's presence was a void too heavy to ignore. That night, police returned with K-9 units. The dogs picked up a trail from the parking lot leading toward the shoreline. They followed the scent, pulling handlers forward, until they stopped at the water's edge. The waves had long since washed away any visible trace, but the dogs whined, circling, unwilling to move further. It was as if the trail ended in the sea. Divers combed the shallows, pushing against the current, searching desperately for any sign of Rachel. They found only drifting debris, seaweed, broken shells, a lost flip-flop, nothing that could confirm her fate. Each passing minute felt like sand slipping through an hourglass. The longer Rachel remained missing, the smaller the chance she was alive. By midnight, the search was called off due to rising tides and poor visibility. Officers promised to resume at first light, but for the Monroe family, the pause felt unbearable. Linda was escorted back home, her body trembling with exhaustion, while Daniel paced their living room like a caged animal. On the mantel sat Rachel's graduation photo, her smile frozen in time, staring back at him as if asking why he wasn't doing more. The next morning, Clearwater woke to headlines that would change its identity forever. Eights, university student missing, car found abandoned at Honeymoon Island. Eights. The image of Rachel's smiling face, pulled from her high school graduation, spread across television screens and front pages. Parents began warning their children not to walk alone at night. Campus hallways echoed with hushed conversations. Could it have been someone she knew? Was it a stranger? For a town built on sunlit tourism and quiet beaches, the sudden intrusion of violence was jarring. Clearwater was no longer just a coastal retreat. It was now the backdrop of one of Florida's most unsettling true crime cases. In those early days, investigators cast their net wide. They interviewed co-workers from the coffee shop, classmates from the university, even neighbors from Rachel's dorm. Every timeline was scrutinized, every alibi tested. One name kept surfacing again and again. Ethan Clark. Ethan was Rachel's ex-boyfriend, a 22-year-old business student. To many, they had seemed like the perfect couple. They dated for over a year, sharing classes, weekends at the beach, late-night study sessions. But the relationship ended abruptly in January 2008, just 3 months before Rachel vanished. Friends offered conflicting stories. Some said Rachel broke it off to focus on her studies and her research. Others whispered about heated arguments, about Ethan's jealousy, about his struggle to let go. Just a week before her disappearance, witnesses claimed to have seen the two arguing at a campus bar, Ethan's face red with anger as Rachel turned away. When police arrived at Ethan's apartment, they found him cooperative but visibly nervous. He insisted he had nothing to do with Rachel's disappearance. On the night of April 12th, he said he had stayed home watching a basketball game with his stepfather. But to investigators, the alibi seemed thin. No receipts, no friends, no neutral witnesses, just his stepfather's word. The suspicion was enough to ignite a firestorm. Word spread across campus, dividing students. Some believed Ethan was guilty, fueled by stories of his jealousy. Others defended him, insisting he was incapable of harming Rachel. For the Monroes, it was unbearable to consider. Linda had once welcomed Ethan into their home, thinking of him almost like a son. Now she was haunted by the thought that he could have been the one to hurt her daughter. Ages de force. Behind the public turmoil, the police pressed on. They collected DNA samples from Ethan, comparing them to the evidence recovered, the torn jeans, the blood. In 2008, DNA testing wasn't as advanced as it is today, but it was reliable enough to confirm one chilling fact. Ethan's DNA was not present on the evidence. It should have cleared him completely. And officially, it did. But suspicion doesn't always bow to science. Whispers continued. Tabloids ran lurid headlines. Did the jealous ex slip through the cracks? And for Ethan, life became unbearable. Though not charged, he was marked, shadowed by the case for years. Meanwhile, the Monroes were left with even fewer answers. If not Ethan, then who? And why? The early days of Rachel's disappearance created a psychological wound that went deeper than crime scene photos. For the community, it was the sudden realization that safety was fragile. A girl they all knew, who poured their coffee, who shared their classrooms, who smiled on their sidewalks, had vanished violently, and the culprit was still out there. For the Monroe family, it was torture. Every ring of the phone could be news. Every knock at the door, a potential answer. Linda clung to Rachel's belongings, the sweater left on her bed, the sneakers by the door, as if her daughter might walk back in any moment. Daniel grew quieter, retreating into long silences, staring at the bay as though searching for her reflection on the water. And for you, watching this now, imagine standing in that parking lot at Honeymoon Island. Imagine the cold breeze whipping through your hair as you stare at that abandoned car, the footprints disappearing into the tide, the denim stained with blood. It forces you to ask yourself, if someone you loved vanished into the night, leaving only chaos behind, how far would you go to find the truth? If Rachel's story moves you, if you believe stories like this must never be forgotten, comment 1. If you think we can do better in telling these stories, comment 0. Your feedback helps keep the light shining on these dark corners of true crime cases. When Rachel's car and the chilling evidence were recovered at Honeymoon Island, the Clearwater Police Department knew the clock was ticking. The first 48 hours of any missing person case are critical, and investigators scrambled to build a timeline of Rachel's final movements. They combed through her shift at the coffee shop, interviewed co-workers, and traced her route toward the beach. But one name rose to the surface again and again. Ethan Clark. Ethan was Rachel's former boyfriend. At 22, he was a business administration student at the same university. By outward appearances, Ethan seemed like the kind of young man you'd expect to see in campus leadership roles. Confident, athletic, always surrounded by friends. But to those who knew Rachel closely, the end of their relationship in January 2008 was more than just a breakup. It was a rupture filled with arguments, jealousy, and unhealed emotions. Friends remembered seeing Ethan at campus events, glancing toward Rachel across the room, his expression unreadable. A week before she vanished, a classmate named Allison told police she witnessed the two arguing at a local bar. Rachel, calm but firm, insisted she wanted distance, while Ethan grew visibly agitated. He left the bar alone, his face twisted in frustration. To detectives piecing the puzzle together, the image was clear. A jealous ex-boyfriend unwilling to let go. On April 14th, just 2 days after Rachel's disappearance, detectives arrived at Ethan's apartment. He lived with his stepfather on the outskirts of Clearwater, in a modest townhouse lined with trimmed hedges. Ethan answered the door looking pale and nervous, though he tried to mask it with polite cooperation. Inside, investigators questioned him for hours. Ethan repeated his story. On the night of April 12th, he was at home watching a basketball game on TV. His stepfather confirmed the account, but police noted the weakness of the alibi. No receipts, no electronic timestamps, no additional witnesses. Only one man's word stood between Ethan and suspicion. Psychologically, it was easy to imagine motive. Jealousy has long been one of the darkest sparks in true crime cases. It's an emotion that feeds on rejection, twisting love into something unrecognizable. For detectives, Ethan fit the profile, the spurned lover who might have followed Rachel that night, confronted her at Honeymoon Island, and let rage overtake reason. As the investigation deepened, Ethan's life began to unravel. Word spread quickly around campus. Students whispered in hallways. Professors exchanged knowing looks. Some of Rachel's friends believed he had always been too controlling, too quick to anger. Others swore he couldn't have done it, that his love for Rachel was real. The public, too, leaned into speculation. Local news outlets hinted at Ethan as the prime person of interest. Tabloids spun the narrative of the jealous ex, publishing side-by-side photos of Rachel's smile and Ethan's stern expression. In coffee shops, in dorm lounges, in the very places Rachel once walked, people debated whether Ethan Clark had killed her. For Ethan, every knock on the door felt like another layer of suspicion. Strangers looked at him differently, some with pity, others with disgust. The weight of being suspected in one of Florida's most disturbing true crime cases settled on his shoulders like a permanent shadow. Behind closed doors, detectives pressed harder. They asked about his last phone calls with Rachel. Ethan admitted he had texted her a few times in the weeks after the breakup, hoping for reconciliation. Rachel's replies were polite but distant. When shown those messages, Ethan lowered his gaze, acknowledging she had wanted to move on. The psychology here is powerful and disturbing. Rejection often creates a forked path. Some accept it and grow, others fixate and spiral. Detectives wondered if Ethan had been spiraling. They noted his fidgeting hands, his quick defensiveness when Rachel's name was mentioned. Every gesture seemed to confirm their suspicions. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. They needed evidence. Investigators collected Ethan's DNA and fingerprints, comparing them to what had been recovered at the scene. The torn jeans with blood, the footprints in the sand. At the state lab, technicians worked late into the night, swabbing, amplifying, and running profiles. The results came back with an unexpected twist. Ethan's DNA was not present on the jeans, nor did his prints match those found on Rachel's car. Forensic science, at least in 2008, cleared him of direct involvement. The detectives were stunned. The neat narrative they had built, the jealous ex, the violent confrontation, the crime of passion, suddenly collapsed. Without evidence, Ethan could not be charged. Yet even with the science absolving him, suspicion clung stubbornly. For many in Clearwater, the story had already been written. And once suspicion takes root, it rarely dies quickly. The psychological toll was brutal. Ethan continued to insist on his innocence, but his protests were drowned out by whispers. He tried to return to classes, only to find himself shunned. A group of students staged a small demonstration outside the university, holding signs that read, "Justice for Rachel," and, more ominously, "We know who did it." Eights. His professors treated him with awkward politeness, but the underlying judgment was clear. Even his stepfather noticed the shift, recalling how neighbors who once waved warmly now avoided eye contact. For Ethan, life in Clearwater became unbearable. Though never charged, he became a ghost on campus, a pariah in his own town. It's chilling to imagine, isn't it? To be accused of the worst possible act, your face associated with evil, even as science whispers your innocence. You might ask yourself, if you were in Ethan's shoes, could you withstand the weight of being branded a killer? For the Monroe family, The situation was no easier. They had once welcomed Ethan into their home, sharing dinners, laughter, and trust. Linda had seen him as almost a son. But after Rachel vanished, every memory felt poisoned. When they heard rumors of the bar argument, when they saw Ethan's face on TV, the suspicion lodged deep. Linda later admitted she didn't know what to believe. Her heart told her Ethan wasn't capable of killing her daughter. But her fear, that gnawing, relentless fear, whispered otherwise. Daniel, quieter and more stoic, refused to say Ethan's name, as though speaking it gave the suspicion power. This is one of the cruel truths of true crime cases. They don't just fracture communities, they fracture relationships. Friends, families, and entire towns are split between doubt and conviction, long before a courtroom ever hears a word. Meanwhile, Clearwater itself began to crack under the weight of uncertainty. Parents no longer let their children roam freely at night. Joggers avoided the beach. Businesses that once bustled with laughter now buzzed with anxious conversation. Rachel's disappearance wasn't just one family's tragedy. It was a collective trauma. Police held press conferences, urging the public to remain patient. They reminded everyone that no suspect had been officially charged. But their words did little to ease the paranoia. For many residents, the phrase "no charges" translated to "no justice." 8. The investigation pressed on, but each lead grew colder. Every dead end deepened the community's unease. And with Ethan unofficially cleared yet socially condemned, suspicion began to drift elsewhere. People whispered about strangers spotted near the beach, about odd neighbors, about shadows that once seemed harmless. In Clearwater, trust eroded like sand under the tide. For Ethan, the damage was irreversible. Within months, he withdrew from the university. The shadow of suspicion followed him beyond Florida, shaping every introduction, every glance. Though DNA had cleared him, public opinion had already rendered its verdict. The Monroe family, too, was left adrift. Without a clear suspect, their grief hardened into a deeper despair. Linda sat nightly in Rachel's untouched room, clutching the sweater her daughter had last worn. Daniel roamed the shoreline, staring into the waves, wondering if answers lay just beyond the tide. The investigation, once urgent and burning, began to lose momentum. The unanswered questions grew heavier. If not Ethan, then who? And if not now, then when would justice ever come? If you believe the truth should always be pursued, and that no family should be left in uncertainty, comment A1. If you think we can tell these stories better, comment 0. Your feedback ensures we continue shining a light on the darkest corners of true crime cases. When months turned into a year, and then another, Rachel Monroe's case shifted into that dreaded category no family ever wants to hear. Cold case. For investigators, it meant leads had dried up, witnesses had nothing new to give, and the trail that once seemed fresh had been swallowed by time. For Rachel's parents, Daniel and Linda, it meant something far more devastating. Waking up every day to the same silence, the same unanswered questions, the same hollow ache. By late 2008, police had publicly admitted they had no viable suspect. Though Ethan Clark's DNA had cleared him, his shadow lingered in conversations. Some still insisted he was guilty, while others whispered that perhaps a stranger had been lurking near Honeymoon Island. Without proof, theories multiplied like cracks in glass, each one refracting a different, painful version of the truth. The Monroes lived in that fractured reality. Linda rarely left the house. She spent long hours in Rachel's room, running her fingers across her daughter's books, her seashell collection, her neatly folded clothes. Sometimes she whispered as if Rachel could hear her. "We're still looking, sweetheart. We haven't given up." Daniel handled his grief differently. He became methodical, almost mechanical, printing flyers with Rachel's graduation photo, posting them at grocery stores, libraries, and gas stations. "Remember this face," he told strangers. "She can't just disappear." The community's reaction evolved in the unsettling ways. In the early years, Clearwater rallied around the Monroes. Hundreds attended vigils at Honeymoon Island. Candles flickered in circles on the sand, voices prayed aloud, and reporters broadcast live updates. The story gripped Florida as one of the state's most haunting true crime cases. But over time, attendance at the vigils dwindled. The first anniversary brought hundreds. By the fifth, only a few dozen remained, mostly close friends and professors. By the 10th, the gatherings were smaller still, quiet and intimate, almost private. The media, once eager, relegated the story to a few paragraphs buried in the local section each April. For the Monroes, this shrinking circle of remembrance cut deep. They didn't resent the neighbors or classmates who moved on. They understood life pulls people forward. But they felt abandoned all the same. Their grief was permanent, yet the world treated it as temporary. The psychological toll was immense. Linda's health began to fail. Doctors attributed her recurring hospital visits to stress and depression. She had heart palpitations, sleepless nights, and a weight that seemed to age her twice as fast. Yet every time she returned home, she went straight to Rachel's room, sitting in silence for hours. Daniel tried to stay strong, but his hair turned gray quickly, his back bent with invisible weight. Each evening, he sat on the porch staring at Tampa Bay, whispering as if Rachel might rise from the water. Even the community changed. Parents told their children Rachel's story as a warning. Don't walk alone at night. Always let someone know where you are. University students heard whispers of her disappearance as a local legend, a cautionary tale told to freshmen. Honeymoon Island itself seemed altered. Fewer people stayed late, and some admitted they avoided the beach entirely after dark. Fear seeped into Clearwater's identity. A place once known for sunshine and tourism was now shadowed by a story no one could shake. Every year on April 12th, the Monroes returned to Honeymoon Island. They lit candles, held hands, and watched the waves roll in. At first, crowds gathered with them. Later, it was only a handful. But Daniel and Linda never stopped. Even if no one else came, they would be there. By 2015, 7 years after Rachel's disappearance, Clearwater celebrated its centennial. Amid parades and music, the Monroes quietly set up a table in the town square with Rachel's photo and white flowers. Some passersby stopped, placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, and whispered condolences before rejoining the festivities. The contrast was devastating. Joy and celebration all around, while their grief remained frozen in 2008. Rachel's case became a scar on the town, not bleeding anymore, but never healing. For residents, it was something spoken of in hushed tones. The girl who vanished at Honeymoon Island. For the Monroes, it was a wound that refused to close. You might ask yourself, what does it feel like to live year after year with no answers? Imagine setting a place at the table every holiday, knowing it will remain empty. Imagine hearing the phone ring, only to realize it's another false lead, another dead end. That's the torment of cold cases. They aren't just unsolved crimes. They are suspended lives, leaving families caught between hope and despair, unable to mourn fully, unable to move forward. Rachel's absence was felt everywhere. Her sneakers still by the door, her desk still holding her half-written notes, her laughter still echoing in memories but silenced in reality. For Daniel and Linda, every day was a haunting reminder that time had moved on, but justice had not. By the late 2010s, genetic genealogy was making headlines across the United States. Cold cases once thought unsolvable were being cracked open with new technology. But in Clearwater, the Monroes were told little could be done. The DNA from the torn genes hadn't matched anyone in national databases. The trail was dead. Still, Daniel refused to let go. He called the police station regularly, asking for updates. He wrote letters to local representatives, begging for attention. Linda joined support groups for families of the missing, her grief merging with others, forming a painful community of loss. Their persistence became their lifeline, even when everything else seemed hopeless. Clearwater, meanwhile, adjusted to life with unanswered questions. The vigils grew smaller, the media quieter, but the wound remained. Residents locked their doors earlier, glanced twice at strangers, and spoke of Rachel as if she were both a cautionary tale and a ghost. For nearly 14 years, from 2009 to 2022, the case stood still. Every April, a brief article would appear. Police continue to seek information on Rachel Monroe. The words became formulaic, predictable, almost lifeless. But for the Monroes, those small mentions were lifelines, proof that their daughter hadn't been forgotten entirely. Then, in early 2023, everything would change. If you believe no family should ever have to wait decades for answers, comment 1. If you think we can tell these stories better, comment 0. Your feedback helps us keep shining a light on the darkest corners of true crime cases. For 14 long years, Rachel Monroe's case sat in silence, classified as cold, her parents left with nothing but grief and ritual vigils. Then, in early 2023, a spark of hope emerged from an unlikely source. Science. Florida announced its participation in a new program, forensic genetic genealogy. Across the country, this revolutionary method had cracked open cold cases once thought unsolvable. By re-examining old DNA evidence and matching it to public genealogy databases, investigators could build family trees and trace suspects who had eluded justice for decades. To most Floridians, the announcement was a small line in the news. But to Daniel and Linda Monroe, it was a lifeline. They had clung to Rachel's sweater, her notebooks, her seashells, but what they longed for most was truth. And now, at last, there was a chance. Detectives sent the preserved DNA sample from the torn genes, the one that had yielded nothing in 2008, back to the lab. With advanced sequencing technology, scientists reconstructed a nearly complete genetic profile. It was like taking a blurred photograph and slowly sharpening it until the features became unmistakable. Weeks later, the breakthrough came. A partial match surfaced in a public genealogy database, not to the killer himself, but to a distant relative. From that faint thread, genealogists began the painstaking task of building a family tree, tracing connections across marriages, migrations, and generations. Piece by piece, the branches narrowed until one name remained at the center: Mark Doyle. At first glance, Mark Doyle seemed ordinary, almost forgettable. In 2008, he had been 37 years old, a freelance air conditioner repairman who lived just 2 blocks from the Monroe family. He was divorced, quiet, with no violent criminal record. Just a few minor offenses, speeding tickets, a disorderly conduct citation. Nothing that screamed danger. Back then, detectives had dismissed him as irrelevant. He wasn't in Rachel's social circle. He wasn't a known predator. He was just another name in a sea of background checks. But the DNA did not lie. Investigators began quiet surveillance. They followed his routines in 2023, noting his habits, his odd disappearances, his solitary life. The opportunity came when he discarded a half-empty soda can in a public trash bin. Detectives retrieved it, sent it to the lab, and waited. The results left no room for doubt. The DNA on the soda can matched the DNA from Rachel's jeans. After 15 years, Clearwater finally had a suspect. And when police informed the Monroes, Linda collapsed into tears. She had waited so long for a name. Daniel sat in stunned silence, his hands trembling as though holding the weight of both relief and fury. The man who had stolen their daughter wasn't a shadowy stranger from another town. He was a neighbor who had lived minutes away. The revelation stunned Clearwater. Residents scoured their memories, trying to recall Mark Doyle. Many remembered him fixing their air conditioners, carrying groceries, even offering friendly nods in passing. He was the man who blended into the background, invisible until his name was spoken. The betrayal cut deeper when old photographs surfaced of Mark among the volunteers who had searched for Rachel in 2008. He had stood shoulder to shoulder with her parents, passing out flyers, even attending vigils. To realize the killer had hidden in plain sight, feigning sympathy, was almost too much to bear. A retired officer later said, "He was there the whole time, watching us search, hearing our prayers, and he knew exactly what he'd done." In July 2023, detectives made their move. At dawn, they surrounded Mark's modest rented home in North Clearwater. Neighbors watched as he was handcuffed, his face expressionless, and placed in the back of a police car. The charges? First-degree murder and kidnapping of Rachel Monroe. The arrest footage spread like wildfire. On television screens, on phones, on social media, Clearwater residents saw the quiet neighbor they had overlooked for 15 years. Headlines blared, "Eights. Search volunteer turns out to be killer." Eights. Justice delayed. Clearwater man arrested in 2008. Cold case. Eights. The shock rippled beyond Florida, sparking nationwide coverage. Mark Doyle wasn't just a name anymore. He became a symbol of how monsters can hide in the most ordinary places. For Ethan Clark, the former boyfriend once suspected, the news was bittersweet. In a rare interview, he admitted living under suspicion for 15 years had nearly destroyed him. "People thought I was guilty," he said. "I lost friends. I lost school. I lost everything. Now the truth is out, and it's more horrific than any of us imagined." His voice cracked when he mentioned Rachel, reflecting both relief and the scars left by suspicion. For the Monroes, the truth was both a gift and a new wound. Linda wept, remembering the time Mark had handed her a bottle of water at a vigil, his eyes steady, his voice calm. "I thanked him. I said, 'God bless you.' All along, he was the man who killed my daughter." Daniel recalled letting Mark into their home once to repair their air conditioner, walking past Rachel's room. "If I had known," his words trailed off, but the implication was clear. He would have done anything to protect her. Clearwater was consumed by anger. How had police overlooked Doyle in 2008? Why hadn't the DNA been tested sooner? Protests formed outside the police station, signs reading, "Justice for Rachel. Never again." Editorials blasted the system for its failures. But beneath the outrage was another feeling: betrayal. Doyle hadn't just killed Rachel. He had deceived an entire community, standing among them, pretending to share their grief. Parents looked at their neighbors differently now, wondering who might hide a similar darkness. And you, watching this, might feel that chill too. The unsettling realization that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears the face of a neighbor, someone who smiles politely as they pass your driveway. That's what makes true crime cases like this one so haunting. They force us to see that monsters are not always strangers in the dark. Sometimes, they live just 2 doors down. For Daniel and Linda, the arrest was not closure, but confirmation. Their daughter's killer had a name. Their pain had a target. And after 15 years of silence, they could finally believe justice was possible. If you believe no community should suffer in silence for so long, comment 1. If you think we can do better in telling these stories, comment 0. Your voice helps us keep shining light on the darkest shadows of true crime cases. When Mark Doyle was finally placed in an interrogation room, the mask of an ordinary neighbor began to slip. At first, he sat silent, arms folded, eyes fixed on the table. But hours of questioning chipped away at his defenses. What spilled out was a confession that left detectives chilled. On the night of April 12th, 2008, he said he drove past Honeymoon Island after drinking a few beers in his garage. He saw Rachel step out of her car, her canvas bag slung casually over her shoulder. He called out, asking if she wanted to walk with him. When Rachel shook her head and quickened her pace, something inside him snapped. In his own words, the rejection ignited a rage he couldn't control. He grabbed her. She resisted. She screamed. He struck her, then strangled her in a blind frenzy. When her body went limp, he panicked, dragging her into the brush, leaving behind the chaotic footprints and the torn jeans. "I didn't mean to kill her right then," he said flatly. "But when she stopped breathing, I knew it was over." 8. The details matched the crime scene perfectly, facts never released to the public. The torn denim, the keys left in the ignition, the footprints dragged into the tide. It was confirmation beyond any doubt. For investigators, it was the kind of confession that not only closed a file, but painted the horror in unforgiving color. In 2024, the case finally reached a courtroom. The trial of Mark Doyle drew crowds from across Clearwater and reporters from across the country. For many, this was more than a trial. It was the culmination of 15 years of fear, anger, and unanswered questions. The prosecution presented its case methodically. The 2023 genetic genealogy breakthrough, the DNA from Doyle's discarded soda can, the crime scene photos from 2008, and the recording of Doyle's confession. Witnesses testified, including residents who remembered seeing him among the search volunteers. One woman recalled vividly, "He was holding a flashlight, walking just a few feet from Rachel's parents. I'll never forget that look now. It feels so cold." 8. The defense tried to argue coercion, suggesting Doyle had been pressured into confessing. But the evidence was too precise, too damning. No one but the killer could have described the scene in such detail. Throughout the proceedings, Doyle sat expressionless. He rarely made eye contact with anyone, his face a blank wall. For the Monroe family, his indifference was almost worse than his crime. To see the man who had stolen their daughter's future sit, unmoved, was a cruelty beyond measure. Linda wept when the recording of his confession played. Daniel, his jaw clenched, never looked away. They had lived in darkness for over a decade, and now the truth was laid bare in front of the world. The psychology of the crime left experts shaken. This wasn't a calculated act, not the work of a seasoned predator. It was the eruption of fragile pride, the monstrous violence born from one word. No. As one analyst explained during coverage, rejection can act as a trigger for hidden rage. In many true crime cases, it is the smallest spark, a refusal, an insult, a dismissal, that unleashes catastrophic violence. Rachel's death was not the result of a master plan, but of a neighbor's inability to accept boundaries. That truth made it all the more terrifying. On sentencing day, the courtroom was packed. Some people stood in the hallways, craning for a glimpse. The judge's voice was steady as the verdict was read. Eights. The court finds the defendant, Mark Doyle, guilty of first-degree murder with overwhelming evidence. His actions were senseless, barbaric, and inflicted an unhealable wound on the Monroe family and the Clearwater community. Justice, though delayed, has come. This court sentences Mark Doyle to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A's. The room erupted in gasps and stifled sobs. Linda clutched Daniel's hand, her shoulders shaking, tears streaming down her face. Daniel's lips moved in a whisper. Rachel, justice has come. For the first time in years, their eyes held something other than despair. Not peace, perhaps, but release. Rachel Monroe's story did not end in the courtroom. Though her life was stolen, her legacy began to grow in ways she once dreamed of. In the fall of 2024, the University of South Florida launched the Rachel Monroe Scholarship for Marine Biology, honoring the young woman who had devoted her heart to the ocean. At the ceremony, students gathered beneath a plaque etched with her name. Daniel touched the letters with trembling hands, while Linda wept softly, whispering that her daughter's dream would live on through others. Each year since, the scholarship has supported students passionate about marine conservation, carrying Rachel's vision forward. Beyond education, her case reshaped how Florida and America viewed cold cases. The use of forensic genetic genealogy became a model for reform. Agencies across the state began reopening old files, applying modern DNA technology to long-forgotten evidence. What once seemed useless suddenly became the key to long-awaited justice. Rachel's name appeared in textbooks, seminars, and conferences as an example of why evidence must always be preserved, and why no family should ever be left in the dark. But her story also raised deeper questions. How many other families sit waiting, just as the Monroes did for 15 years? How many killers walk freely, hidden in plain sight, while the justice system lags behind? Rachel's tragedy reminded the nation that justice delayed is not justice denied, but it is justice that costs immeasurable pain. In many true crime cases, technology arrives too late, after decades of suffering. Her legacy insists that it must not be this way again. For Clearwater, Rachel became more than a victim. She became a symbol of perseverance, of how a community scarred by betrayal can still push for change. Each April, candles are lit on Honeymoon Island, flickering against the waves. People gather not just to mourn, but to remind themselves that truth, no matter how delayed, must always be sought. And for you, watching this now, Rachel's story is not just about one girl, one town, or one trial. It is about vigilance, respect, and the relentless pursuit of answers. It is about remembering that monsters often hide in plain sight, and that silence is never an option. If Rachel Monroe's journey moved you, help us keep her memory alive. Comment 1 if you believe these stories must be told, or 0 if you think we can do better. Don't forget to subscribe, because together, we will continue shedding light on the darkest true crime cases still waiting for justice.